Hello everyone, welcome back to Kishore Chess Mentor. In the last session, we saw how to play with the double pawns, when to go for it, when to avoid it, when it is a strength and when it is a weakness. So in this session, we shall see like the isolated pawns. So to start with, isolated pawns in generic terms, it can be cause of weakness because it is not being supported by any of the other pawns. And I'm going to give you a few examples to evaluate when it is kind of weak and when it is kind of strong. So to start with the first position. So here c6 is an isolated pawn. Okay. So c6 is an isolated pawn because it is not being supported by any of the other pawns. Okay, so c6 is not being supported by any of the other pawns, hence it can be a target of attack. So how can we attack it? We can attack it with, say, starting with rook c1. Okay, and after that probably like what we can try is straight away like knight to d4 or say knight to e5. Okay, and once this happens, then the bishop on g2 will also start attacking c6, and then if required, queen can go to c2 and attack it, or queen can go to a4 and attack it. So plenty of chances are there in order to attack the isolated c6 pawn. So having said that, this can be a weakness in this particular position. So is there any positivity in this position? So this c6 pawn, this isolated c6 pawn is letting black to have an semi-open d5. Okay, so this semi-open d5 he can play along. So right now this is a weak pawn. So having said that, let's jump on to the next position. Okay, so in this particular position, okay, so pretty much if you see here, there are no isolated pawns as such. There are two pawn islands, one on the king side and one on the queen side, and there's a pawn majority for white on the queen side and for black on the king side. So having said that, so there is a capture that is happening with bishop into c5. So there can be three captures. Okay, either this bishop can be captured by the queen, or this bishop can be captured by the knight. And the third capture, which is kind of an important capture, is capturing bit back with the pawn. So here you can question me like, this is now an isolated pawn, and isolated pawn can be a choice of attack. So is it good or bad? So to answer that question, so the c5 pawn is certainly not a weakness because there is a white pawn sitting before it. So which means that it is not easily attackable. That is one. And what good is, I mean, like in having the pawn on c5? So pretty much if we see, right, so having the pawn on c5 is controlling the d4 here. So the knight cannot go to d4. Okay, so the important squares cannot, I mean, it is taking kind of a vital square control on d4. So the pieces, white pieces cannot go on attack, go on play on d4. So this is one. And what else? So right now there is no weakness in the white's camp with respect to the pawn structures. As black has captured b into c5, what is happening is this particular b2 pawn is kind of a backward pawn, and there is a b file that has opened for black, so he can go on with rook b8 and then he can try to attack this b2. So here the isolated pawn is good. Okay, isolated pawn is stronger. So this is how like we need to evaluate and we need to take a judgment when to go for an isolated pawn, when to go for a double pawn, when to avoid having a double pawn, or when to avoid having an isolated pawn. So this is the second example, and let's move on to the third example. Okay, so pretty much, you know, the most important thing in having an isolated pawn is, okay, to have kind of let's say for example, if we are playing against the isolated pawn, this is what we need to do. Okay, we need to exchange the minor pieces in the sense, say for example, we need to exchange the so the reason to exchange the minor pieces is minor pieces can give a dynamic play. The whole concept of having the isolated pawn is the side. Okay, let's say if white is having the isolated pawn, this is what white will try to do. White will try to create some dynamic play, and the dynamic play is only going to happen with the minor pieces. So this is what black has to do. Black is going to play against the isolated pawn, and black, what he has to do is he needs to exchange the minor pieces. So there is no idea of or no plan of having a dynamic play for white, and then he need to hold on to the major pieces. So one or two rooks probably with the queen as well. So what he will try to do is, this is what he is going to do. He is going to pressurize on the isolated d pawn, and two pieces attacking the d pawn and two pieces defending the d pawn, and finally there is a third one that is coming up with e5, and black has won a pawn here. Okay, so this is the whole intention, the whole idea of having an isolated pawn or playing against an isolated pawn. This is what it is. If you are going to have an isolated pawn, what you have to do is you need to go on having the dynamic play. Okay, so this is what you need to do. And in case if you are going to play against a dynamic play against an isolated pawn, what you have to do is, like, you need to exchange the minor pieces. Okay, and then you need to hold on with your major pieces and start attacking the isolated pawn. So now the pawn is going to get lost because the rook is pinned on d1. Okay, so having said that, let's move on to the next one. Okay, in this particular position, okay, so I told you, like, there is something dynamic one, right? So here the pawn on d4 is an isolated pawn. This particular pawn is an isolated pawn. So when it comes to dynamic play, so here he can go on with e5. So white has some space advantage, and the pawn on d4 is taking control of the vital e5 square. Okay, this is pretty important. And at times what he will try to do is, he can try to move d4 to d5. Okay, so he will look for the right time to do that. Okay, so here this is what he has to do. White will try to hold on with his minor pieces, and then he will try to create a dynamic play against black. So he won't exchange much of his minor pieces, whereas on the other hand, black, what he will try to do is, he need to stop this particular pawn advance. Say for example, the square before the pawn, okay, should be blocked. Okay, this particular square has to be blocked. Okay, the reason to block is to freeze the pawn there, and then to go on with exchanging the minor pieces, so that, like, the dynamic play is completely off the plan, and then finally to have an attack on the particular d5 along with the rook as well as the queen. Okay, so having said that, this is the whole idea behind playing with an isolated pawn and playing against an isolated pawn. When to go for an isolated pawn and when to avoid having an isolated pawn. And the most important thing is, you need to understand, like, when we need to dissolve the isolated pawn, but like this. Okay, so having said that, let me move on to the next one, the final position. So here this is pretty interesting. Okay, so I mean, I told that, so once all those pieces, I mean all the minor pieces has been exchanged, you have to start attacking with your rook as well as with your queen. So here the rooks are off the board. Okay, the rooks has got exchanged, and finally, like, it is queen versus queen. So when you look at this position, okay, can we hold on to this position? Can white hold on, or is there a way for black to win this pawn? Certainly there is no way for black to win this pawn, because I mean, there is no much pressure that which he can do apart from having the queen. The king cannot come and attack the d4 pawn, so that is quite out of the question. And the pawn to here doesn't work because the queen is not pinned, so white will be happily, like, holding this position. So it is kind of an equal one, and it is quite difficult for black to break this chain. Okay, I hope, like, you would have understand, like, how to play with an isolated pawn and how to play against an isolated pawn. Okay, it is not that having an isolated pawn by itself is kind of a weakness. So if you are going to have an isolated pawn, you need to look for dynamic play. In case if you are going to play against an isolated pawn, you need to block that pawn, and then, like, you need to start exchanging the minor pieces, and then you need to finally, like, pressurize the pawn, and you need to win the pawn. Okay, exchanging the minor pieces, I mean, like, it depends upon the position, because, like, you might have kind of very I mean, like, very active pieces, whereas your opponent might have kind of passive pieces, and there is no point in going ahead and exchanging it. You can simply put the pressure with your minor pieces as well on the isolated d pawn, and you can win the pawn. Thanks for watching the video. I will see you again in another video. Thank you.